we're there to help that person who has a solid plan, has availed themselves of what they need to actually get that business up and running. That's who we're there to serve. And the majority of our clients are low to moderate income, minorities, women, and as well as immigrants and other quote unquote disadvantaged sectors of the population that would not be able to avail themselves of these kinds of services to move their business forward or to grow their business. So that's who we are there to serve. And we do a variety of them, from daycares to various in the beauty, cosmetology industries, to furniture makers, jewelry makers, those who are in the fashion industry. We're very involved with the Macy's Fashion Incubator. We provide the technical assistance to folks, those who are in the area of the arts, variety culinary arts, auto repair, you name it. You know, our clients really run the gamut: transportation, construction. And, you know, in our slide here, the two women here, Milk and Sugar, they started with a food truck bakery, and then they moved from the food truck to a brick and mortar, a retail space. So now they worked with us for that type of training and technical assistance to grow. And then also they came back and were able to secure a loan in order for them to move into that commercial space. So that's in a nutshell who we serve. So, you know, as far as how you can work with us, we certainly love to have folks come in and either look for ways that they can invest into our loan fund, as well as being able to invest into our programming, because it does take quite a lot of technical support working with our clients, whether they are just coming to us for business development or coming to us for lendings. A lot of our bank partners refer folks to us because they're not quite there yet to get a loan, and they recognize they need to get that business support. And that's who we're there to serve, to make sure that they get what they need so they can move on to the next level. And then we also work with our partners. We're not the end all be all. So we have quite a lot of partners in the community. There are other CDFIs that a lot of times we work simultaneously with, depending on their needs, as well as we've also partnered on participated in loans because they needed more than either of us could offer. So we did a participation loan to be able to give them what they needed.
Great, Tony. Thank you. Let's keep moving. Andy Racklin from Reinvestment Fund.
All right, I've had some technical difficulties, so let's make sure you can hear me. Mark, am I good?
You are good.
Great. Then let me turn off I had my phone set up as a backup just in case you couldn't, and you're giving me some feedback there, so let me fix that. So my name's Andy Racklin. I'm with Reinvestment Fund. This will give you a sense of the breadth, which I think was Mark's point, of the CDFI industry. You know, we're a regular partner of Entrepreneur Works, but a fairly different institution. We started, as many CDFIs did back in the 80s, in response to the divestment movement. And we began first and foremost as an affordable housing lender, making small loans to affordable housing projects here in the Philadelphia region. And have grown a fair amount over the intervening 35 odd years. At this point, we've deployed a little over, getting close to $2.5 billion worth of capital over our history. We currently manage about $1.2 billion in capital. And in a given year, we make somewhere between $170 and $250 million worth of loans. And while we are still based here in the Philadelphia region and have our largest presence here and do the largest share of our lending here, we've expanded in that respect as well. So we now have offices in Baltimore and Atlanta and do lending really up and down sort of the eastern seaboard and east of the Mississippi, and then even to some degree beyond that. We've also expanded the kind of lending that we do. So we started, as I said, as an affordable housing lender, which is still really an important part of our practice, but over the years have started to do a number of other things as well. We have a large food access lending business, which is, lending to grocery stores and food deserts, but also food hubs and food banks and distribution centers and a wide variety of food businesses, urban agriculture to some degree. We have a large healthcare financing practice where we're lending to federally qualified health centers and other kinds of health delivery businesses and nonprofits that work in low-income communities. We do a smattering of various kinds of commercial real estate. We have a large education finance practice, which lends to early childhood education centers and daycares and various kinds of K-12 schools, mostly charters, but also other kinds of K-12 schools. And then finally, and maybe most unusually for a CDFI, we have a very large clean energy finance practice where we lend to a lot of solar and building energy retrofit type projects all over the country. And that's actually over the last year or two been our fastest growing lending practice. And then beyond lending, Reinvestment Fund has also expanded to some non-financial activities. We have a data research consulting group essentially that helps governments and philanthropies and others who are trying to think about how do you invest in low-income places use data to think about their investments. And spun off of that, we actually have a technology platform that some folks here might have used called Policy Map that is intended to be a sort of data dashboard for investing in communities in a data-informed way. So that's sort of the span of the things that we do. And I think we wind up meeting organizations at a different point in their life cycle than what you heard described for Entrepreneur Works. Our average borrower is coming to us. They may be somebody who needs to use capital regularly as a part of their business. They're an affordable housing developer or they're a developer of grocery stores, but the sort of traditional world of capital won't finance them for some reason. That might be because they're operating in communities that banks are not totally comfortable going into, or for some other reason. That's one kind of borrower, the sort of capital intensive that doesn't have access to capital markets. Or the other kind of borrower is an organization that doesn't have capital market relationships or banking relationships because they virtually never use capital, but they have a one-time or irregular need for a very significant and complex financial transaction. So an example would be a food bank that needs to build a big distribution center. Any given decade, that food bank might not do a lot of financing, but at that moment, they need to put together a complex financial transaction to build this big physical asset. And so what Reinvestment Fund winds up being is in some ways a pillar standing between the sort of traditional financial markets and borrowers who don't fit in those financial markets in one way or another. We wind up being a risk mitigant for the financial markets and also a translator for their capital, getting it into those transactions, and also a translator back for those borrowers who don't necessarily know how to position themselves for the financial markets. So we have, over these years, developed a fairly strong balance sheet that has allowed us to do things like get a very strong credit rating from S&P. That allows us to borrow on competitive terms from the sort of traditional financial markets by issuing general obligation bonds, which has been our largest source of financing for the last several years. And then to take that money, essentially put our balance sheet between the traditional financial markets and these transactions that wouldn't find their way to a traditional financial institution, and then deploy that capital from those bond issuances into those community serving transactions, be it the food bank building its distribution center or an affordable housing project or whatever it winds up being. So that's been our role. And in terms of how folks can work with us from an investment perspective, we're trying to grow. And this is something I expect I'll wind up talking about more in the course of this conversation. We're trying to grow the range of ways that people can work with Reinvestment Fund. For many years, we've had what is called a note program. Essentially, in a number of states, we have registered notes that are sort of state-level corporate securities that anybody can buy in increments of $1,000 or more, and over different terms: 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, 15 years, whatever, and just basically get sort of a fixed rate general obligation corporate security from Reinvestment Fund. Those are unrated and private. Then, as I mentioned, institutional investors who are active in the bond market can, when we do an issuance by our rated issuances, we've done about $125 million of those issuances over the last couple of years. They've mostly been purchased sort of at issuance by insurance companies, and while they're tradable, they have CUSIP numbers, they have tended not to trade. The companies that have bought them have largely held them, but that is out there. And then most recently, we wanted to diversify the kinds of offerings that we had. Previously, we'd essentially offered people different ways to lend us money, either buying a note from us or buying a general obligation bond from us on the public market. More recently, we started a registered investment advisor subsidiary and have used that to organize what is essentially a series of private funds that we have allowed people to both invest equity into and lend to. Those funds are largely for larger investors, accredited investors, institutional investors, and I can go into them in more detail later, but the idea was to offer a wider variety of risk and return opportunities to investors who wanted to have impact in the communities that we serve and wanted a way of investing in us that went beyond our sort of standard fixed income products that we had offered previously. So I'll just stop there and happy to pick up on whatever later in the conversation.
Thanks, Andy. One of the things that we want you to see with Entrepreneur Works and Reinvestment Fund is these are two CDFIs based in the same city, do very different things, a very different scale, equally important in what they serve. They serve complementary markets, and that there are a number of ways that we've already identified that that investors can be part of what they're doing and help them succeed. But I'm going to sort of roll the camera back a little bit now and take a broader view and ask Kat to talk a little bit about her perspective from the C-Note perspective, and a little bit about what they offer to help investors. Kat?
Thank you so much, Mark. And I love hearing from two CDFIs, and you just heard from two incredible ones. So my name is Kat Berman. I am co-founder and CEO of an impact investing platform called C-Note. At the heart, we make it easier to invest in CDFIs. So a little bit about the genesis story. So we had been observing fans, watching CDFIs for over the last decade and more, and really grew to understand and appreciate what CDFIs are. So at the heart, we know that CDFIs are local community lenders, but we dug deep from an investment lens to really understand their financial performance and their impact performance over the last 30 years. And so when we took that investment lens, we realized a lot of things. We realized, number one, the strength of CDFIs as an industry was sorely undervalued and very poorly visible. And so I think it's one of the reasons we often hear most people not knowing what a CDFI is, not hearing what their local CDFI is, and not investing in their local CDFI. And so on one end, we saw a tremendous opportunity to really make sure that CDFIs received more visibility. Number two, highlight the strength of CDFIs from a financial perspective. And if you look at CDFIs, and Mark said this beautifully, these are organizations that know how to activate and how to excel in times of crisis and in really difficult environments. It's what they do, it's what they've done for 30 years, and it's what they've proven they can do well again and again. And we have a lot of data that I'm happy to share with any of the folks who've joined us today. If you'd like to learn more about this industry and more specifically get some real data in terms of how CDFIs have acted and performed as an industry over the last 30 years, and particularly in times like the Great Recession. And so from a financial lens, very strong industry. And then lastly, but most importantly, I would argue impact. As both organizations shared today, at the root of CDFIs is a desire to ensure that their communities thrive, and so that a community like Philly can be as equitable and as sustainable as humanly possible. CDFIs play a critical role in that. And so from an impact lens, what we found as a platform is that there were many CDFIs doing this hard work across the country with tremendous track records that had very poor visibility and were actually hard to invest in. And this was really the genesis of C-Note. So we took a technology lens where we said, well, if we can create the pipes to make it easier for you, the investor, to plug into either one CDFI or a whole slew of CDFIs, we could really open up new capital for the CDFI industry. Our focus is obviously serving low-income communities, underserved communities, women and minorities, and we measure that. So what we take very seriously, looking at this from an investor lens and really also creating measurable impact reporting so that investors can see very tangibly where their dollars are going and what the impact that CDFI is generating. And again, a couple of things that we've been able to introduce to make it less frictionful for investors is the ability to have a variety of return profiles, liquidity profiles, and also the ability to customize. To give you an example, as Mark shared, there's over 1,000 CDFIs across the country. And even in Philadelphia, there are a number of CDFIs working on incredible projects ranging from, climate to microlending to women's equality and onwards. And so how does a investor, whether an institution or an individual, get to hone in on what you care about and invest accordingly? And that's part of the technology we built so that you can let us know what is the theme or what is the geography that you want to invest in, and how do we better connect you to those CDFIs and package in a way that is very digestible and doesn't take you hours and hours or months and months to execute that investment. So if you want to go to the next slide. I wanted to share a little bit of what you can do now, because as you can tell, we are strong advocates of investors learning about the CDFI industry and of course exploring an investment in the CDFI industry, whether it's your local CDFI or into a nationwide basket of CDFIs or thematically. It really is an important industry to explore. But I also want to share how important this industry is today. As Mark referenced, this is an asset class and an industry that for years has been working on crisis issues. As we step in and as we merge and move into this recovery period for this country, CDFIs are absolutely front and center in terms of the economic recovery of the United States. They have already been doing the hard work in our communities, and I'm sure both presenters have a lot of war stories they can already share in terms of demand they're seeing from their clients already and from new clients. And they will play a critical role in making sure that not only our communities recover from this devastating impact, but that the recovery is equitable. And that's a really important piece I think many of us on this call believe, is that we don't want to come out of this pandemic with a greater wealth gap that we came into it with. And yet the opportunity for that to happen is very viable. When we look at who aid has already gone to, and some of the structures in place, we know that that's a potential. If we're going to mitigate that risk, CDFIs have to be at the table, and they have to be that part of your investment thesis. A couple of the things that we've stood up in light of this are two things. Number one, we have a fully insured FDIC cash solution where 100% of those dollars go to low-income communities, specifically targeting those hit hardest by COVID-19. So that's a fully insured cash product. And then we also have a patient lending product that goes to CDFI loan funds like the ones you heard today, who are looking for long-term patient capital. That is very flexible capital for those CDFIs to use over a 5-year period and a 1% return. I will just end, if you want to learn more about some of the other response efforts that are happening across the country and through some very specific CDFIs, we do have a resource page that has a lot of that data on the mycnote.com link that I shared below.
Thank you, Kat. That's terrific. Hopefully we've given you a quick overview, and I'm imagining that there may be some questions. So if you have questions, please enter them in the chat box. Jesse, anything that people need to know, participants need to know about finding the chat or anything?
So if you're going into Pathable, you'll see the chat. It's right next to the polls. So one question we could talk about is, are CDFIs by definition resilient?
Great question. Who wants to take that, panelists? So Tony, you're muted, Tony. Come talk to us. There we go.
Apology. Had some outside noise and I muted so you wouldn't hear that. But yes, I can speak to the experience that we've had at Entrepreneur Works. You know, when you talk about the recession, I can recall during that time where a lot of large businesses were downsizing, folks who were making six figures were suddenly out of work, or their salaries were significantly reduced, were then turning to us because they're realizing that, okay, the years of experience, I can turn that into a business that I can do on my own. So suddenly, when a lot of the larger businesses were downsizing and experiencing losses, we were finding that more and more people were turning to starting their own business. And we were swamped with people coming to us for that kind of support. As well as, you know, we've had instances where it affected us with funding because we rely heavily on our funding comes from government sources, federal, state, local, as well as foundations and also some individual donations. But where we were experiencing a lull in our funding, you know, as more and more people were turning to us for help because starting a business was their way out, was their way to increase the income for themselves and their families, that we were having to then reinvent and looking at going outside of the box of our normal funding sources. So then developing additional relationships with other sources of funding that then came and then offered the help to us to invest into our loan fund or support our programs to really meet the demand. Because, you know, when the economy goes south, we get busier. And that's been our experience. So we've been able to reinvent ourselves. And when I say that, in ways to look for other means to secure the resources that we need to be able to find the programs. And after 30 years, we're still here.
That's right.
Yeah,
CDFIs are counter-cyclical. Go ahead. Who's going to answer?
this is Andy. I was just going to add two things to that. You know, I've had a bunch of investors ask me that over time. And of course, the questions have become more salient in the last 2 months than they were for the several years before that. But I think there's sort of a couple fundamental things about CDFIs that really do make them resilient. And one is, you know, if you think about, you know, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we work pretty close to the base, right?
Mm-hmm.
So where other kinds of financial institutions that are chasing maximum return are frequently, you know, chasing investment opportunities that, you know, speak to the newest, the latest, the, you know, whatever, those things might not be quite so fundamental, so they can fade when the economy turns, right? You know, the latest app is not that important when you're trying to figure out how to keep a roof over your head. But CDFIs tend to work in, you know, at an essential level, right? We're funding housing and education and very small sort of community serving businesses that are themselves providing food and clothing and other basic things. And so there's actually some resilience in that, right? It's not accidental that a huge portion of reinvestment funds portfolio is grocery stores. And in, you know, even in this pandemic, like those are, and in the recession, those did very well because people still fundamentally needed food, right? That's not a genius on our part. It's not because we're so smart that we, you know, thought of it that way. It's because that's what's important and we go to what's important. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is I remember in the last recession having a conversation with someone who was a partner at one of the big consulting firms. I won't say which one, but the McKinsey types of the world. And I was talking to him about the cyclicality of his business. And he said that the genius of an organization like mine, and folks can feel free to disagree with him, but I thought it was an instructive way of thinking. He said the genius of an organization like mine is that we are essentially we are a empty vessel of capacity, right? We are a ton of really smart people who are good at figuring lots of different kinds of things out. So when the economy is booming, we help people figure out how to grow. And when the economy is contracting, we help people figure out how to shrink. And either way, we're getting contracts, right? And again, there's a level of mercenariness in there that I'm not, you know, I'm not trying to engage with the substance of that business. But I think there is an analogy for CDFIs that if you look at who works at CDFIs, the people who are drawn to them, there tends to be a very they've been very successful over the years, and this is across not just reinvestment fund. I'm talking about the entire industry, at attracting a wide variety of skill sets, a lot of very high capacity people with a lot of different kinds of aptitudes, and that has made them very adaptable. So when the need on the ground has changed, the organizations have been able to alter their fundamental DNA to adapt with it. So I think the combination of sort of working in fundamental areas and having that sort of adaptability have been really crucial to CDFI staying power over time.
I think that's right, Andy. I think CDFI agility was a skill we learned we had during the Great Recession, and we may come back to the Great Recession. But I want to talk a little bit about the role of investors in being able to support that agility, how you capitalize, how being aligned with your investors makes a difference. So, Kat, I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about how that alignment makes a difference in creating a resilient financial intermediary like the CDFI.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So again, we've heard so many qualities of the CDFI industry, and I have my own stories about the resiliency that we're seeing across the country. And so hearing from Tony and Andy, you're getting a piece of what's happening nationwide of the strength of the CDFI industry. And so then the importance is, how does an investor look at it from their lens? And I think what we've seen is CDFIs can play a very important role as it relates to your fixed income and cash allocation. If you're thinking about how does your portfolio align with your values, whether you're an institutional investor or an individual investor, many of us have figured it out on the public equity side, right? We've probably done our filters and our scans depending how far, but very few have figured it out on the fixed income side. And so we're always trying to kind of piece in a green bond here or a not so bad bond there. CDFIs are this incredible opportunity to actually do something very meaningful with your fixed income allocation. And whether it is through an individual note, like TRF, or doing one of the products that we have, or a customized product through our platform, there are different ways you can access that market to get specifically to what you're looking for, both from a risk and return profile. It's not a one-off. It's not, take it or leave it. There's a wonderful spectrum, like we shared, everything from FDIC insured CDFI activation to getting to more long-term CDFI bonds. And so there's a real nice spectrum on the risk and return profile. And there's an amazing spectrum as it relates to investing in what you care about, whether that is, racial equity, whether that is women's empowerment, whether that's homelessness or food deserts. There's really this wonderful wealth of opportunity to get both needs met with the strength, as each of the panelists have shared, with an industry that's been around and showed you how they champion capital preservation. And that's really how we think about it at C-Note, as the CDFI industry truly is a champion of responsible capital preservation. And so when we think about our allocation mixes, that's usually the bucket we put them in.
Yeah. Tony and Andy, I just want to ask if you have examples of investors' flexibility or patience that's affected what you did. You may not. I just don't know if you do, because there's a question about the Great Recession that I may answer. But go ahead. If you have any thoughts.
Those who have investors that have come to us have done it in one or two ways. Either they've done it just by offering just straight grants into our loan fund, or low interest loans that we've been able to use over time. And since it's a revolving loan fund, it's something that we're able to keep using that pot, but we're always looking for ways and having conversations with investors that are looking to do that, what best suits their needs, and also what we're doing. And then we also can look at some invest in some specific types of programming, specific areas that they want us to focus on with their investment. And we've done that as well.
And so that the grant money, the extra grant money, and the concessionary pricing makes it possible for you to pay for the technical assistance and the other kinds of support.
Technical assistance.
To take the risk, reduce the risk. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Good. Andy, did you want to take that on at all?
Sure. I'll answer not quite the question you asked, but I think it's a good example from the Great Recession leading into this next one, which is, most of our capital, most of the money that we have to lend, we've borrowed, and increasingly we're not borrowing it on concessionary terms. Particularly, we're just borrowing money, in the capital markets at a level and an interest rate sort of in accord with our credit rating. But the good thing about that that method of borrowing that's really important to us and that other investors over our history have given us the freedom to do has been, so long as you guys are meeting your leverage ratios and other important tests, you guys reinvestment fund make decisions about your portfolio as you see fit. And that is a freedom that we have as a non-bank financial institution that has proven really important in moments of crisis. If we roll the clock back to the last financial crisis, it was first and foremost a real estate crisis. And a lot of banks sort of froze up their lending very quickly and started to try to work out their portfolios. And this wasn't just about incompetence or greed or other sort of negative motivations that you could attribute to it. It was also about a sort of regulatory framework that those kinds of financial institutions had to live in, where they had to sort of rapidly clean their portfolio to meet their regulatory burden. And so their motivation was very much to sort of default, foreclose, sell, right? Even if that meant losses for them, that was kind of the motivation. And reinvestment fund didn't have to do that. We didn't have those pressures. So we were able to look at our portfolio and say, look, borrower, we know that your housing project is deeply distressed right now, but we believe in you as the operator. We believe in your project. We believe in your community. And so we're willing to hold for a really long time. So we had projects that we held, without accruing interest for literally years, but that ultimately were able to turn around and fully repay us because we had the flexibility to do that. And so we did not have to write those projects off in the same way that a bank would have to. We didn't have those pressures. And that kind of flexibility was incredibly important.
Yeah. So one of the questions that came in was, someone said, I think I read somewhere that CDFIs outperformed the broader market coming out of the last recession. Is that correct? Can you provide some context? I'm going to provide a little context because I was probably more involved in that than you were. But I want to do it by way of giving you a little time to think about, as you go into this crisis, and we're really just at the beginning of it, and you think about how it's going to affect what you do. What are the things you're looking for? Where do you need investor alignment and investor support as you go forward? How do you think about that in some way? So give a minute to think about it. But just a little history on the last recession. In late 2008, the leaders of the CDFI industry, I was fortunate to be in that group at that time, really sort of started thinking about what's going to happen when we all fail, right? Who's going to turn the lights out? And there was just this assumption that when you're lending in markets that are perceived as really risky, even if we've managed the risk really well, that this tsunami was going to do us under. And that quickly became clear that wasn't the case. And part of the reason it wasn't the case is we had lenders. MacArthur Foundation, I remember, was I think gave a year's forbearance on interest payments and they were all interest payments. And other lenders, other investors made some concessions and things like that. But the reality was, as all of you have talked about a little bit earlier, is that CDFIs are close to the ground and know their borrowers and understand their risks and price them accordingly. And CDFIs were also really good the last time around about writing down their assets in a way that, frankly, mainstream financial institutions were reluctant to do, sometimes for regulatory reasons. And so, in fact, CDFIs did generally outperform most of the market. That's not a good thing for the record, but did outperform most other investments in the market for a period of about 3 years. And, that we've documented that a little bit. It doesn't mean they did anything better than they did otherwise, but they, as an industry, the industry has a net charge-off rate of about 1% for all assets. And it's a remarkable experience, and they're well-capitalized institutions. So that's just by way of context. But as you look ahead to what's ahead, right? And this is not, there's no V in this recession. Someone called it a swoosh recession. I think that's being kind. This is going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult, Tony, for your small businesses. It's going to be difficult, Andy, for developers and for, educators who can't operate schools and all that stuff. What would you like to see from investors in a sense? Or how do you think about the market? Maybe it's too soon to ask that, but how do you think about the market going forward, and what's going to be most valuable to you from the investor space? And Kat, you're talking to investors every day, so who wants to take that? Anybody? I tried to give you a little lead time.
I know.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely too soon to ask it, right? So, but let's take a swing at it anyway. I think a couple of things. One, and this is going to go back to some of my earlier comments. patience is going to be incredibly important because the economic world has stopped in a way that it has never stopped before. And we don't exactly know when it's going to fully restart. And what's been interesting is that even watching sort of more traditional financial institutions, everybody kind of recognizes that. So when everybody stopped together, mutual patience is a little bit easier. So we are seeing that from investors, and it's incredibly important. A second thing is going to be coming to a conformance of opinions on what is fundamental to sort of human existence and will therefore survive the pandemic, right? I think if I look across our portfolio, we can make that argument better with some of the things in our portfolio than others. It's really easy to argue that housing and food access and clean energy are fundamental to existence more so than maybe some of the other things that we fund. And particularly in an urban context where sort of close-in living is being challenged by this pandemic, investors agreeing on what asset classes are fundamental and are therefore merit patience because they will come back because they have to for humans to survive is going to be really important. Then I would say the third thing is sort of engaging with CDFIs, which are not at all exclusively urban creatures, but we are talking at the moment about an urban, we're talking to 2 CDFIs headquartered in Philly that don't work just in urban areas, but do work significantly in urban areas, as do a lot of CDFIs. And I think engaging CDFIs are going to have to be deeply engaged as our investors in CDFIs about what the future of cities looks like and what this pandemic will teach us about the weaknesses of cities and how to create resilience. There's been a lot of talk about resilience in the past however many years. A lot of it is focused on sort of environmental risk. This has highlighted a different kind of risk of urban existence. And so CDFIs and their investors are going to have to be proactively engaged in that conversation about what this experience is teaching us about cities, and then how that trickles down into investment thesis.
So let me go into one aspect of this as you think about telling your story going forward and how you want investors to see you. And Kat, I'll start with you, which is the question of impact. One of the things that's happening now is impact investors and CDFIs are in some ways closer together than they've ever been, and they do overlap. But just because there's a recognition, I've been really pleasantly surprised at the number of impact investors who I've said, right now we need to invest in CDFIs because they're on the front lines. But tell the impact story, right? I mean, this is about impact investing. What do people need to know about CDFIs, not just in the crisis, but in the crisis and beyond from an impact perspective? How should they think about investing in CDFIs? Kat, let me start with you.
Yeah. So I'm gonna couch that with also answering your first question. And I think the 3 things that we're hearing, because we're on the phone every single day with our we work across the nation with CDFIs, and we're very blessed to work with an incredible group. And there's 3 things I think we're hearing what they're asking from investors, which is learn, align, and commit. Learn it is new for most investors, whether you're an impact investor or whether you're an investor going, this may be a good time to think about something outside of my traditional. It's time to learn about CDFIs. So I'm so grateful for this panel and for all of us sharing what they are. It's not a secret. They've been around for 30 years, but it is really kind of an untapped opportunity, I think. So first is learning about what they do and why they do it. I think second is align with what you need. Investors that we talk to, and to your point, we equally talk to investors every day. It's really understanding the why for you. So is the why for you to invest locally because you want to see Philly jump started faster and more equitable? Is the why for you because you want to diversify your portfolio? Is the why for you because there's a specific area you care deeply about? And maybe that is food deserts, or maybe that is immigration rights at a time right now. So whatever it is that is important to you, there's often a very obvious alignment with what CDFIs are doing right now. And so that is a real magic that we can do and align it so you can see the natural place that you want to play and that CDFIs are already playing, which makes for a great investment. And then the last, obviously, is commit. There's a lot of great and well-intentioned people out there, but unfortunately, we're in the middle of a pandemic. So now we really need to move from this exploratory, maybe one day I'll do an impact investment, to committing and actually moving those money. Because as our friends will tell you, there is a unprecedented level of demand happening in our communities that needs to be filled from a variety of channels, but certainly from those of us in the impact investment and institutional space. So that's what I'm hearing across the board. And then just to kind of shed a little bit on that, when we talk about impact, whether it's very specific to an investor's need or we talk about this environment. In this environment, we talk a lot about what does recovery look like and who do you want as that partner in recovery. And I can tell you, as you guys know, CDFIs are the entities that are going to lead us into a more resilient economy that's more equitable. They're not going to leave the women behind. They're not going to leave communities of color behind. They are on the front line making sure that that capital is really going to those communities in need that are often overlooked by traditional finance. So we make the case not just on the individual likes and desires that folks feel drawn to, but we also make the case that if we're serious about getting out of this faster and in a more equitable way, you have to involve CDFIs. They are absolutely on the front line.
Yeah, and in a sad way, they're sort of the fastest growth market right now for investors. But Tony.
If I could just add a little different spin on impact, as we are having to help our businesses recognize the new normal. What's the new normal going to be? You know, it may be that, you know, they're going to have to redefine their businesses altogether. It may be that they're going to have to make some adjustments. But the reality of it is if we allow the communities to remain the way they are, where the business or incomes are dramatically reduced, if we're not working with the local government to help them recognize what the new normal needs to look like, the negative impact that that's going to have on that community is going to decrease the value, decrease the quality of life, increase crime. And that's going to be a problem for all of us. So I would ask that the investors would do is come along with us to understand recognize there needs to be a new normal, a new way of looking at it, and a new entity that you need to involve, such as CDFIs, when you're looking at investing your money to really make an impact. Because when you allow an individual, a family, to be able to make a living for themselves, you increase their quality of life, you cause them to increase the value of where they're living in their community, and that adds to the overall development of that community. That causes new life to spring up. Other businesses want to come back in, other want to come in and invest, just all the way around. So, you know, I'd like us to look at impact from that angle as well, that if we don't do something, if we just stop, this is going to be a negative impact that's going to affect us all.
Yeah, part of that is understanding that even though they're transactional businesses, they're trying to play a transformational role in their communities, and they play a civic leadership role. And so, Tony, I'm glad you brought that out and really made that point. There's time for a few more questions. We have 7 minutes left, which means we can take 20 more questions, because I promised a lot of content. Not really. But if there are more questions, please contribute them. One thing I want to ask about, that someone raised a question, I'm going to modify the question a little bit, is is there a difference in the investors you're seeing and the investors you relate to by generation? There are different generations thinking about this differently. Do you have different conversations, with investors because they're 30 and they're 60? I mean, does that happen? The answer may be no. You can just say no.
Yeah, I've experienced a difference in generation, even just the way, I hate to use that term, the millennials, but, the way they look at things, they're much more global in their thinking. And they, seem to from my experience, much more personally involved. They don't just want to make a monetary investment. They're looking for ways that they can invest themselves. How do we get involved to support what you're doing?
All right. Kat, were you going to say something, or?
Yeah, no, I was going to echo that. I think what's been interesting for our journey is when we first started, we absolutely saw the greatest, I'd say, interest coming from millennials. And I'm with Tony that it's a very broad phrase. You have to become, careful to couch everyone, because it's such a wide array of individuals in that bucket. But we did see a lot, let's say a younger generation really stepping up, interested in C-Note, interested in CDFIs, excited about the impact. But I'll tell you what's been interesting is we've seen that change over the years. So over the years, our investor base has dramatically grown much bigger than that. And we still see a great inflow of millennials, but we're seeing a lot of Gen X and a lot of baby boomers interested. And of course, the institutions that they support, the donor advised fund that they're a part of, or the foundation that they contribute to, also stepping into this. And so I think the good news is we're seeing a trend of what I call looking under the hood, where it literally was really the millennials years ago who were the only ones asking us, tell me what you mean by impact. So when you say racial equity, what does that really mean? And we love that question because we have those rich stories coming from CDFIs of the actual work they're doing, right, to change the game in their community. It's not a way of analyzing a company. It literally is direct investment into these communities. And so that looking under the hood used to be very much concentrated in the younger generation. No longer. We're seeing a lot of other types of investors step up and ask those same important questions around, tell me what real impact is, show me the story, show me the metrics. And so for that reason, I think we're seeing a really positive tide of the interest around this type of impact investing move from just that generation onwards.
That's great. What was that, Jesse? What was the statistic about what people think about when they think about investing in CDFIs? I think it was overwhelmingly impact, right? It wasn't risk at all, right? People weren't focused on that.
Yeah, it was 84% impact, and then something else.
And then something else. We don't know what the rest of it was, but we can make that up. Andy, did you want to take that on at all, the generational question? If not, I have one last question for our panelists.
I agree with what Tony and Kat said.
Yeah. Good. So here's the last question. It's a crystal ball question, which is, let's look ahead. We're in the middle of a crisis. It's sort of the best time to try and stop yourself a little bit and look out over the frothing waters around you and the challenges that you face and everything. And think, if you want to tell investors where you're going to be in 3 or 4 or 5 or 2 years, whatever that is, what do you want investors to know and to think about what you're doing at C-Note, at Reinvestment Fund, at Entrepreneur Works Fund? What do you want them to be able to see, in a sense? What do you want them to be able to anticipate? Give you a second. No one?
I'll make it quick. I think what we'd like to see, and I think what we will see, is greater visibility and understanding of the CDFI industry, right? Well deserved. And so I think the devastation and horror that this pandemic is bringing is also offering an opportunity to highlight this important industry and what it does for our communities every day. So I do think we're going to see more visibility of CDFIs and their important work and how they function in times of crisis, right? Crisis is not new for them. Yeah. And so I think we're absolutely going to see that. And then again, from our lens at C-Note, really what we're trying to do is make sure that we advance this as an industry and as an investment opportunity. So what we want to see is in all your portfolios, right? We want to make sure that CDFIs are an active piece of your portfolio that you're proud of, that you understand, and that you see as an important piece of diversification when you think about fixed income investing.
Right, thank you. And when you say more visibility, you mean among investors, right?
Correct.
Yeah, okay, I just want to make sure that's right. Andy, Tony?
I think I'd say, Mark, that I would want people to see that on the one hand, we took the moment for the scale and gravity that it deserves, and we took the opportunity, even while we're being transactional, to be transformational, to use your terms, that we thought really deeply about the inequities that this pandemic lays even more bare, and that we've tried to use the tools at our disposal to and the attention, as Kat put it, that is going to come to those issues because of this sort of incredible moment to really move the needle, to be transformational as it regards those inequities. But at the same time that we've done so with the same attention to the long term and the connection that a long-term view has with being a responsible steward of investor money that we're known for, that those, that we will continue to insist that those things are not, that those two things don't stand in opposition if you take a long enough view. And I think that's what I'd want folks to see in us.
So really enduring, equitable, inclusive, sustainable change, right?
Yeah, the way that I've put it is that if you have a long enough time horizon, all in like all good investment is impact investment.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. Tony, last word for the panel
Yeah,
today.
that's the only thing I mean, just add to it is just for them to see the importance of that divide between racial and economic inequity has to be lessened, and that CDFIs play a key role in doing just that.
That's awesome. Thank you. Tony, Andy, Kat, thank you so much for being here and sharing your experience and your expertise and your perspective. Jesse, thank you for your support. I'm not sure how we sign off, but I think we're all done here.